At least do not make today about you, my mother whispered. Susan dragged the empty folding chair beside me toward the center of the family row. Its metal legs screamed against the linoleum, drawing several glances. I did not come here to do that, I said. I had arrived exactly on time after flying from Colorado the previous afternoon, sleeping near the Columbus airport and driving a rental car 45 minutes to Merritt Air National Guard Base. I wore a plain navy suit. No uniform, no aide. Nothing that announced my rank. Susan saved the chair for a cousin who had not arrived. I placed my phone face down on my lap and remained at the end of the row. Near the rear wall, a young crew chief named Maya Torres held a manila folder against her chest. A white discrepancy report showed through the opening, along with the corner of a red tag. My father kept looking toward the rear doors. Colonel Marcus Reed introduced Chelsea as the logistics officer who kept everything running when others gave up. Susan applauded harder than anyone. Chelsea stepped to the microphone in her new uniform. Duty means staying when pressure makes others run, she said. Her eyes found mine for only a second. Then they shifted toward Maya. The warning in Chelsea's expression lasted longer than her smile. After the pinning, Susan gathered officers and relatives for photographs. I stood outside the circle with my coat folded over one arm. A retired major recognized me. "Are you still serving, Rachel?" Susan stepped between us before I could answer. "She had her chance," my mother said with the sweet public voice she used when she wanted cruelty to sound like concern. "The military found a place to hide her after she could not handle real responsibility." She pointed toward Chelsea. "This is what a successful daughter looks like." A few guests gave uncomfortable laughs. Most stayed silent. My fingernails pressed into the seam of my coat pocket. I released my grip before answering. "You have told that story for 15 years, I said. "You should be certain it can survive being checked." Colonel Reed had been walking toward our group. He stopped when he saw me. A captain leaned close and whispered, "I heard only fragments. Prior enlisted at 17. Systems safety. Vacancy appointment at 40. The appointment was rare enough that the announcement had traveled quickly through the component. Marcus straightened to attention. "Ma'am," he said, staring at my face. "You are the general?" He corrected himself immediately. "General Donovan, we were not told you were coming." "I am here as a sister, Colonel," I said. "This is not an official visit." The room went still. Chelsea looked from Marcus to me, waiting for someone to explain the mistake. Susan's mouth opened, but no words followed. My father did not look at me at all. He was staring past my shoulder. The glass doors at the back of the room opened. Earl Mercer walked into the auditorium. He was my father's former quality inspector. He walked with a slight limp, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. He looked exhausted, carrying the weight of a secret that had aged him terribly. Walking beside him was Lydia Grant, my attorney. Next to Lydia was a man in a plain gray suit who carried the unmistakable posture of a federal investigator. Earl held a sealed plastic evidence container against his chest. He did not show the contents, but the shape of a thick book pressed against the clear plastic. A sharp crash made me turn. My father had dropped his water glass. The shattered pieces scattered across the floor in a wide arc. Ice cubes slid across the linoleum, bumping against my sensible black shoes. Chelsea frowned. She clearly did not recognize Earl immediately. She had been too young back then, or perhaps she just never paid attention to the people working on the warehouse floor. But my mother recognized him. Susan took a half step backward. Her heel caught on the edge of the photo backdrop stand. She grabbed my father's arm to steady herself, her knuckles turning white. My father closed the distance between us. His face was the color of old parchment. He leaned in, his voice a low, frantic hiss meant only for my ears. "You brought him here?" he asked. "No," I said. I looked at the old inspector, then back to my father. He finally brought himself. The investigator walked straight toward our group. He did not shout. He did not pull out handcuffs or make a theatrical scene. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded, printed document, and handed a preservation notice to my father. Robert Hale, your company is required to preserve all records, devices, and communications immediately, the investigator said, his tone entirely devoid of emotion. Colonel Reed stepped forward. His voice was firm, reclaiming control of his facility. Take this outside the ceremonial area. Now. My father grabbed my elbow. He tried to pull me toward the side hallway, away from the staring eyes of the remaining guests. You are using your rank to destroy your own sister. You planned this. I pulled my arm free. I brushed my sleeve where his fingers had gripped the fabric, removing his touch. I declared my family connections and signed a recusal memo 4 days ago. I do not control this investigation. I do not issue warrants. My father looked at the sealed container in Earl's hands. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. That ledger was destroyed. I did not pretend to misunderstand him. I held his gaze, refusing to let him look away. You ordered it destroyed. That is not the same thing. Earl stepped closer. His voice trembled slightly, a frail sound in the quiet hallway, but his grip on the plastic box remained absolutely firm. And this time, I kept the order too. Chelsea pushed past our mother. She marched into the hallway, her face flushed with a mix of anger and sudden dawning confusion. The new silver oak leaves on her shoulders caught the harsh, fluorescent light overhead. Rachel, what is going on here? Chelsea demanding an explanation just as she always had when we were younger. I looked at her new rank. Then I looked past her to the back of the hallway. Maya Torres had followed the investigator outside. She was still holding her manila folder, standing near the doorway. Ask your crew chief why she was told to change a safety report, I said. Chelsea spun around. She pointed a finger at Maya. The authority in her voice sounded practiced and hollow, an imitation of command. Tell them the part failed because you mishandled it. Maya did not flinch. She did not look at the ground. She opened her folder and pulled out 2 pieces of paper. She held them up, side by side, right in front of my sister. Which version do you want me to lie about, ma'am? Maya asked. Colonel Marcus Reed did not hesitate. He stepped between Maya and my sister, his uniform brushing past the young crew chief as he extended a hand toward the side exit. We are moving this to conference room 4, the colonel said. My mother immediately pushed forward, her expensive floral dress rustling loudly in the sudden quiet of the hallway. She reached for Chelsea's arm. I should come with her. This is clearly a family misunderstanding, and we can sort it out together. Marcus blocked her path. His posture was perfectly polite and entirely unyielding. Ma'am, you will wait in the reception area. This is a unit matter, and civilian family members do not sit in on internal inquiries. Susan opened her mouth to argue. Then she noticed the federal investigator standing quietly behind the colonel, watching her every move. Her jaw snapped shut. She settled for glaring at me, her eyes promising a severe reckoning later. We walked down the corridor in complete silence. The small conference room smelled of dry erase markers and ozone from a heavy photocopier humming in the corner. I chose a chair against the far wall, deliberately distancing myself from the main table. Chelsea took the seat at the head of the long table. She sat perfectly straight, adjusting her shoulders to make her new rank insignia catch the light, trying to wear her uniform like a protective shield. Maya stood near the closed door, clutching her manila folder tight against her chest. Chelsea pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the young crew chief. Airman Torres, you are speaking completely out of turn, and you are violating chain of command. Marcus pulled out a chair but did not sit down. The airman has the right to present her safety report without fear of reprisal. Proceed. I leaned back against the cool plaster wall. I am a relative and a recused witness. I will only observe. My sister let out a short, bitter laugh. Convenient. You light the fire and call yourself a witness. I met her gaze, keeping my voice low and steady. The part cracked before I knew it existed. Maya opened her folder. She placed 2 sheets of paper on the scratched laminate table. Her hands shook slightly, but her voice held steady as she pointed to the first page. This is my original finding. Suspected material defect. I recommended quarantining the entire lot. She pushed the second paper forward. This is what appeared in the maintenance system 3 hours later. Possible handling damage. Inspect only the installed unit. The investigator leaned over the table to study the printouts. The metadata stamped at the bottom of the second page showed a specific origin point. It had been uploaded from a command workstation, and the timestamp perfectly matched the window right after Maya had been called into my sister's office. Chelsea crossed her arms tight against her chest. My staff assistant entered the code wrong. We had a brief conversation about clarifying the language, and someone simply typed the wrong classification. Maya did not argue. The young crew chief reached into her folder one last time, producing a printed email and a screenshot of a text message. She placed them next to the altered report. "You emailed me to correct the cause code," Maya said. She pointed to the text message. "Then you sent this to my personal phone. You said people who damage a unit's readiness numbers do not last long in this career." The room went completely still. The hum of the air conditioning suddenly sounded incredibly loud. Chelsea stared at the text message, and her practiced mask of authority began to slip. For a brief second, I saw the frightened 22-year-old girl I remembered from a decade and a half ago. I looked at the investigator. "Do you need the crew chief to secure the original physical device?" The question established my knowledge of evidence preservation without crossing the line into giving orders. The investigator nodded, appreciating the procedural prompt. He asked Marcus for permission to visit the hangar. We stepped back out into the main corridor. Through the glass double doors of the reception area, I watched our parents building their defenses. My father paced near the entrance, holding his phone tight against his ear. Robert was already calling the company attorney, undoubtedly ordering his staff to lock down every file and server. Susan sat on a leather bench, typing furiously on her screen. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and read a message from our Aunt Linda. "Why could you not let your sister have one day?" The smear campaign had already begun. Susan was framing my appearance as a jealous ambush to the rest of our relatives. My jaw tightened, but I let the anger pass. I took a screenshot of the message and filed it into my secured chronology application. I did not type a reply. I muted the entire family group chat, then drafted a short email to Lydia Grant. I instructed my attorney that all future communications from my parents must route exclusively through her legal office. We left the administration building and walked toward the maintenance hangars. The morning air carried a slight chill, biting through the thin fabric of my navy suit. Maya led the way across the vast concrete expanse, finally stopping at a secured wire cage at the back of the bay. The cracked actuator rested on a metal workbench inside the enclosure. A bright red tag was zip-tied to the main housing. That tag meant the component could not return to service until a full engineering review was completed. Another technician wearing grease-stained coveralls approached the cage. He looked at Colonel Reed, then at the investigator. "Sir, Major Hale came down here 2 days ago. She asked if we could swap the red tag for a yellow hold for inspection label. She said it would look better for the readiness audit. Chelsea had tried to downgrade the severity physically when the digital alteration failed." I stopped at the yellow safety line painted on the concrete floor. The sharp scent of hydraulic fluid drifted from the caged part, hitting my memory like a physical blow. Cold metal, greasy paper. It was the exact atmosphere of our father's shipping warehouse 15 years ago. Maya pointed through the wire mesh. I photographed the serial plate before we locked it up. She handed her phone to the investigator. I stepped close enough to see the screen, my eyes locking onto the alphanumeric sequence stamped into the steel. HPC. Hale Precision Components. It was the legacy prefix our father used before he rebranded his supply lines. The investigator stepped away to make a phone call to a federal forensics lab. Maya turned to me, dropping her voice so the colonel would not hear. "I heard your seminar last year," she whispered. "The one on written technical dissent." I studied her young face, recognizing the exhaustion around her eyes. It mirrored my own perfectly. Maya swallowed hard. "I was terrified you would think I used your name to jump the chain of command, or that I reached out just to cause trouble." "You filed the report," I said. "You kept the original. You did exactly what you were supposed to do." I paused, making sure she heard my next words clearly. "But from this minute forward, you speak only to your counsel and the investigator, not me." She looked down at her heavy work boots. "It feels like standing on an island." I knew that island well. I had lived on it for a very long time. I had let my family convince me that standing alone was my punishment for telling the truth. "Do not confuse being brave with being alone," I said. My phone vibrated again. Lydia was calling. I walked a few paces away and answered. "The Forensic Materials Lab just finished a preliminary scan on the alloy composition," my attorney said, her voice crackling slightly over the cellular connection. "The metal does not match the certificate standards." Lydia paused, letting the weight of the information settle. "The distributor on the shipping manifest operates under a different name, but the packing code follows a very specific structure." I opened the Secure Archive application on my phone. I navigated to the folder containing the few documents I was legally permitted to retain from my original complaint. I opened the scanned photocopy of an old evidence log. The serial fragment in Maya's report matched the structural pattern of the parts I had red tagged 15 years ago. "This could prove a continuing scheme," Lydia said. "But we need the bridge. We have to connect this new distributor directly to your father." The investigator finished his phone call and walked back toward the safety line. He looked directly at me. "The distributor just provided their internal manufacturer declaration," the investigator said quietly. "It lists Hale Precision's federal entity code right beneath the new trade name. The payments route back to the exact same legal entity." I turned my head. Through the small window of the hangar office, I saw Chelsea pacing. She was holding her phone tight against her ear. She was calling our father. The sharp scent of hydraulic fluid drifting through the maintenance hangar pulled me backward 15 years. The smell always brought back the distinct, tactile sensation of thick paper sliding against my thumb. Back then, I was 25 years old, standing in the receiving area of Hale Precision Components alongside Earl Mercer. The metal marking on the flight control actuator resting between us did not match the certification sheet. The old inspector wiped his hands on a greasy rag, suggesting we keep the unit quiet while he double-checked the paperwork. My father walked onto the warehouse floor before I could respond. Robert wore an expensive tailored suit that looked entirely out of place among the wooden pallets and heavy forklift tracks. He slapped Earl on the shoulder and called me a childhood nickname in front of the entire floor staff. The calculated gesture was designed to strip away my military rank and reduce me to a subordinate daughter. "Just sign the acceptance sheet," Robert said, pointing at the clipboard. "The unit needs its readiness numbers." I picked up a pen, crossed a thick black line through my printed name, and wrote the discrepancy code in the margin. The consequence of that pen stroke arrived during Sunday dinner 2 days later. Robert sat at the head of the heavy oak table, cutting his steak with precise, aggressive motions. He announced that if I kept the red tag in the system, Hale Precision would lose a major contract, and dozens of floor workers would lose their jobs. Susan poured herself another glass of wine. She set the green glass bottle down hard enough to make the crystal ring against the wood. "You do not burn down your father's company over paperwork," my mother said. Across the table, my 22-year-old sister sat perfectly still. Chelsea worked a low-level quality control desk at the time, filing papers and managing inventory. She did not defend me, but she leaned forward and asked exactly which serial number had been rejected. I ignored the question, watching my father instead. Robert offered a compromise. He promised to introduce me to a prominent career placement officer, assuring me a smooth path to promotion if I simply signed a corrected receiving sheet. "If the part is safe, the record will prove it," I said, placing my white linen napkin next to my untouched plate. "If the record has to change first, it is not safe." I stood up, walked to the front hallway, and placed the keys to the car my father had bought me on the console table. Then I called a taxi to take me back to the military base. The next morning, I followed protocol exactly. I did not sneak into the facility or steal classified data. I submitted a formal written preservation request for the receiving records, the scan audit data, and the access control logs. The prime contractor's legal counsel responded by creating a hold image on their servers. After securing the timeline, I filed a complaint with the Inspector General, listing 3 specific anomalies rather than emotional accusations. I sent my father a brief email stating all future communications regarding the contract must be in writing. 3 months later, an aircraft carrying parts from that exact production lot experienced a catastrophic control failure during a training flight. The pilot managed to bring the plane down, but the violent impact killed a loadmaster and left 2 other crew members with severe injuries. I read the casualty report in a small, windowless briefing room. The names printed on the white paper anchored a heavy, freezing weight in my chest that never went away. An investigation launched immediately. The lot was quarantined, and the prime contractor faced severe corrective action. I waited for the truth to surface, believing the system would work. Instead, the original red tag ledger vanished. The distributor repacked the components, erasing the physical trail. The digital receiving log in the military system was quietly replaced by a clean version. The investigators confirmed a quality escape had occurred, but they could not prove intentional product substitution or establish that Robert knew about the defect. They could not access the proprietary sidecar metadata locked inside the legal hold image I had requested because the software formatting was incompatible with their tools. The corporate defense attorney painted my complaint as a bitter family dispute over control. Earl testified that he could not remember who ordered the units moved, terrified of losing the health insurance his sick wife relied upon. Robert lost a subcontract, signed a corrective action plan, and walked away without criminal charges. The military transferred me to systems, safety, and inspection. It was a standard conflict management procedure to protect the integrity of the ongoing review, placing distance between me and my father's contracts. My family, however, found a way to rewrite the narrative entirely. Susan hosted a celebration dinner a month later to announce Chelsea had been accepted into the Air National Guard. Robert raised his glass, offering a toast to a daughter who stayed loyal. He openly compared her to the one who panicked and accused her own blood. I looked at my sister across the rim of my water glass. "Did you ever see the receiving log before it was swapped?" "No," Chelsea said. The denial came far too fast, the single word clipping the air. I remembered the layout of the company office clearly. Chelsea's workstation sat directly next to the digital scanner. I remembered her asking about the specific serial number during that first tense dinner. I did not have the proof to accuse her, so I stayed quiet and logged the interaction in my chronological notes when I returned to my apartment. Susan smiled at me from the other end of the table, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. She told the guests I had been transferred because I lacked the constitution for operational work. "Then I will become very good at the work you think does not matter," I told her. The smell of hydraulic fluid faded, pulling me back to the present moment outside the Merit maintenance hangar. Lydia Grant walked across the gray concrete, holding a sealed forensic folder. The preservation request I had filed a decade and a half ago had forced the creation of a legal hold image, capturing the server state exactly as it existed. Those files had sat forgotten on a legacy backup tape at a storage vendor until this morning. My attorney opened the folder. She pointed to a restored metadata line printed on the top sheet. The investigative software had finally cracked the proprietary formatting. The device identifier of the replacement scan mapped directly to a specific terminal inside the old warehouse. It was Workstation C-Hail. Those letters on my attorney's screen formed a perfectly clear bridge between the past and the present. Staring at the restored metadata out on the cold hangar floor, I felt the final invisible thread connecting me to my family's expectations finally snap. I had spent 15 years building a fortress against exactly this kind of betrayal. The foundation of that fortress started the morning after I left my father's house. I had walked into a local bank branch and drained the joint savings account my parents had controlled since my childhood. I transferred the balance to a new institution under my grandmother's maiden name, Donovan. Next came the personnel office. I stood at a gray metal desk and dragged a heavy black pen across my military emergency contact form, completely obscuring Robert Hale's phone number. Susan left a voicemail 2 days later. My mother's voice sounded remarkably calm, dripping with that terrible, patient tone she used to manage unruly children. She called my sudden independence a dramatic stunt designed to beg for their attention. I did not call back. I sold a diamond watch they had given me for graduation, using the cash to pay the deposit on a small, dark apartment near my new command. A week later, a heavy knock rattled my apartment door late at night. I looked through the peephole. My father stood in the dimly lit hallway, his expensive wool coat damp from the autumn rain. He spoke right to the painted wood, offering complete forgiveness if I simply withdrew the safety complaint and returned to the family fold. My hands trembled against the deadbolt. The conditioning of a lifetime screamed at me to turn the brass lock and apologize for causing trouble. I stepped back. I picked up my phone and dialed the building's security desk instead. The military decided to place me in systems safety, intending to hide a controversial officer in administrative paperwork. I turned their filing cabinets into an arsenal. I memorized accident prevention protocols, acquisition integrity laws, and readiness assessment standards. I caught microscopic flaws in maintenance logs before they became fatal errors. I corrected young airmen without humiliating them, breaking the cycle of fear that my father used to control his warehouse. A senior logistics commander noticed the pattern. He saw an officer who possessed prior enlisted experience from age 17, a commission at 21, and a flawless safety record. He offered me a leadership track that eventually culminated in a vacancy appointment to brigadier general at 40 years old. The promotion was exceptionally rare, but the system recognized someone who protected the machine instead of exploiting it. During those years, Susan religiously mailed an annual holiday card. The glossy photo always featured Chelsea wearing her dress uniform, smiling brightly in front of our parents' stone fireplace. I never threw the cards away. I placed them in a designated desk drawer, closed it, and went back to work. I did not survive those 15 years completely alone. I hired Lydia Grant initially for a routine legal consultation regarding a minor retaliation claim from a base supplier. The attorney did not offer me sentimental sympathy or empty platitudes. "Who knows what you know, and where is it written?" Lydia asked during our very first meeting. That single question became the operating principle of my life. I built a private, chosen family around people who valued evidence over ego. I purchased a small house with my own income. I slowly remodeled the kitchen, installing heavy butcher block counters myself. We hosted Thanksgiving dinners around a table where nobody had to earn their right to eat through absolute compliance. The house smelled of roasted garlic and fresh sage, entirely free from the tension that always choked my parents' dining room. I also maintained a quiet, meticulous record. I did not conduct illegal investigations or access classified servers. I simply saved the documents the law allowed me to keep. I downloaded public contract awards. I archived the letters my mother sent directly to my address. I recorded the dates of Chelsea's promotion speeches, noting exactly when my sister utilized the old incident as a public lesson in duty. Lydia taught me to organize the timeline using 3 strict columns: fact, inference, feeling. The structure protected my sanity against their constant rewriting of history, ensuring I never forgot the truth of what I had seen. That careful organization finally bore fruit exactly 1 week ago. Earl Mercer had called Lydia's office, absolutely refusing to dial my number directly. A former maintenance coworker had warned the old inspector about Maya's newly red-tagged actuator, and the guilt finally outweighed his fear. Sitting in Lydia's office last week, I listened to the speakerphone on her mahogany desk. Earl confessed that Robert had explicitly ordered the original ledger destroyed. He admitted Susan had personally approved a generous consulting severance check the very next morning, paying for his permanent silence. "I kept the book because my wife needed her medical treatments," Earl told the plastic speaker, his voice cracking with old shame. "I thought I was just protecting her." Anger flared hot in my throat, a sudden inferno burning away years of forced calm. "Did you ever read the accident report, Earl? Did you ever see the name of the loadmaster who died because you needed that insurance?" The line went dead silent for 10 agonizing seconds. "I read his name every single year on the anniversary," Earl whispered. "That is why I am calling now." The memory of that phone call dissolved as we walked back from the hangar to the administration building. Colonel Reed secured Conference Room 4, locking the heavy wooden door against the staring eyes of the base staff. The federal investigator set Earl Mercer's sealed plastic container in the center of the laminate table. Lydia hit record on a small digital camera, stating the date and time to establish an unbroken chain of custody. I stood back, refusing to touch the evidence myself. The investigator broke the red tamper evidence seal. The thick plastic snapped loudly in the quiet room. He pulled out the original receiving ledger. The bound book smelled distinctly of old machine grease and decomposing paper. The dark blue cover was warped from years spent hidden in a damp basement. The federal agent opened the book, carefully turning the stiff pages to the center section. Bright red ink slashed across a dozen lines of inventory entries. Earl's jagged handwriting documented the exact material failures I had found 15 years ago. Tucked neatly between the pages sat a piece of thick company stationery. The paper bore a short, handwritten directive in my father's aggressive script. "Remove rejected units from red list before inspection." My chest tightened. Here was the physical proof I could never produce as a 25-year-old officer. My father had actively commanded the cover-up. He had known the parts were dangerous, and he had chosen his contracts over the lives of the flight crews. But the ledger held something else. A small pink correction slip was stapled to the corner of the opposite page. The initials CH sat clearly on the authorization line. The investigator carefully detached the staple using a small metal tool. He turned the pink slip over, placing it flat on the table under the harsh fluorescent lights. A single sentence was written on the back in blue ballpoint ink. "Scanned replacement after complaint filed." I recognized the looping, precise handwriting immediately. It did not belong to Robert or Earl. The letters matched the annual holiday cards perfectly. The forensic document examiner adjusted the heavy magnification lamp over the open ledger. White fluorescent light washed across the oil-stained pages, illuminating 15 years of hidden history. The specialist did not speak for several minutes, moving a small illuminated loop across Earl Mercer's jagged handwriting. He checked the ink sequence, examining where the ballpoint pen had pressed deep into the paper fibers, confirming the entries were written sequentially over time rather than fabricated in a single sitting. The small, pink correction slip sat on a sterile white tray nearby. The examiner pointed a gloved finger at the corner of the slip, showing the investigator how the microscopic paper tears and staple holes perfectly matched the binding of the heavy blue book. Earl sat at a separate steel table in the corner of the room and signed a sworn statement detailing exactly where he had kept the box. Less than an hour later, a message arrived from Robert's corporate defense attorney. The email officially characterized the old inspector as a disgruntled former employee seeking to extort a respected business owner. Lydia Grant read the email on her phone and shook her head. My attorney locked the screen, slipping the device into her leather briefcase. A defense built on attacking the witness only works when the witness stands alone, Lydia said quietly. Strong evidence does not require a perfect messenger. It requires independent physical data that tells the exact same story. 4 days before Chelsea's promotion ceremony, I had sat across from the command ethics official in the Inspector General Council suite. Lydia occupied the chair beside me while 2 military attorneys recorded every disclosure. I named Robert Hale as my father, Susan Hale as my mother, and Chelsea Hale as my sister. I disclosed my limited professional contact with Airman Maya Torres through an official mentorship program. Then I submitted my chronology as witness material, clearly separating what I knew from what I suspected. The ethics official slid a formal recusal memorandum across the desk. Once you sign this, you will not participate in contracting decisions, administrative holds, evidence reviews, referrals, or disciplinary recommendations connected to Hale Precision Components, he said. The restriction was exactly what the case needed, yet the pen felt unusually heavy in my hand. For 15 years, I had waited for the system to see what my family had hidden. Signing meant accepting that I could protect the truth only by surrendering control over what happened next. Lydia leaned closer. Control is not the same thing as protection. You secure the case by removing yourself as a target. I signed the memorandum. The official timestamp fixed my recusal 4 days before Chelsea stepped onto the podium. Now, outside the forensics laboratory, I carried only a certified copy of that memo. I could provide witness material and answer questions about my own actions. I could not guide the inquiry, review its raw evidence, or influence the consequences. That distance no longer felt like helplessness. It felt like protection. Colonel Marcus Reed found us waiting in the reception area, holding a preliminary witness transcript. Just before the command structure officially suspended her security access, Chelsea had summoned Maya Torres into a small office. A senior non-commissioned officer had been present as a mandatory observer. According to the transcript, my sister had attempted to aggressively redefine reality. Chelsea claimed she had merely asked the young crew chief to clarify the safety report, insisting no one had ordered the falsification of a cause code. Maya had immediately presented the preserved text messages and the email directive. Backed into a corner, Chelsea had pivoted to attacking the airman's integrity. The transcript documented my sister accusing Maya of using my name to jump the promotion line. Maya had calmly corrected the record, stating we had never spoken privately before the complaint was filed. The final lines of the transcript recorded a direct threat. Chelsea had leaned across the desk, warning the young airman that regardless of how the inquiry ended, her reputation in the logistics community would be permanently destroyed. The senior non-commissioned officer had documented the intimidation tactic word for word, transforming a past cover-up into current, actionable retaliation. A federal analyst walked into the reception area, handing the investigator a newly decrypted file. The logistics chain was finally beginning to unspool. The distributor archive contained a partial migration table, a digital crosswalk showing how the old serial numbers had been converted into the new lot sequence. The system retention policies had deleted several rows of data, leaving gaps in the evidence chain. However, a junior employee at the distribution warehouse named Noah Kim had noticed the subpoena request. Recognizing the potential danger of flying with uncertified flight control actuators, Noah had voluntarily provided the name of their off-site storage vendor. The young man had no loyalty to me, but he understood the terrifying mathematics of aviation safety. The tax backups and invoice archives are coming next, the investigator explained, reviewing the new paperwork. Noah Kim gave us the bridge. We have the manufacturer code for Hale Precision Components listed beneath the new trade name on the internal warehouse manifest. The web tightened further as we relocated to a secure briefing room. A forensic specialist projected a summary of the restored legal hold image onto a large screen. The preservation request I had filed as a young officer had forced the prime contractor to mirror their receiving server entirely. That mirrored image had sat on a legacy backup tape, completely ignored when the company updated their operating systems 10 years ago. The new decryption software peeled back the proprietary formatting, revealing the raw access sidecar files. The metadata showed the replacement maintenance log had been generated by a specific scanner device. The hardware identifier mapped directly to the workstation assigned to Chelsea Hale. The digital timestamp proves the replacement scan occurred shortly after the internal correspondence first mentioned a military complaint case number, the specialist said, highlighting a string of green text on the screen. The defense would inevitably argue that a device mapping did not absolutely prove who sat in the chair. The specialist anticipated the counter-argument immediately. He pulled up a secondary file from the restored access control export. The workstation login utilized a senior supervisor credential, the specialist continued. However, the preserved travel vouchers from that exact week place that specific supervisor at a facility in Texas. Furthermore, the building access export shows a badge swipe at the exterior door after normal operating hours. The badge belonged to my sister. Standing at the back of the briefing room, I looked at the permitted summary documents arranged on the table. The pattern clicked into place with sickening clarity. I placed the transcript of Chelsea intimidating Maya next to the forensic report of the old warehouse scan. My sister had not simply followed our father's orders blindly. She had learned the mechanics of survival inside his house. The young woman who had altered a receiving date to protect her family's status was the exact same officer who had just threatened a crew chief to protect her promotion. The mechanism had not changed. Chelsea managed reality by fixing the paperwork and punishing anyone who noticed the discrepancy. A sharp pain settled behind my ribs. Realizing my sister was an active participant in the machinery of deception hurt far more than believing she was merely Robert's victim. Colonel Reed stepped into the room, his phone still in his hand. He looked around the table, his expression grave and professional. "The administrative review is officially active," Marcus announced. "Major Hale has been formally relieved of all duties pending the final inquiry results." The declaration carried the heavy weight of inevitable consequence. It was not a criminal conviction, but the military shield my family had hidden behind was effectively shattered. The forensic examiner cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to the projected screen. He zoomed in on the pink correction slip recovered from Earl Mercer's ledger. The initials CH filled the center of the display, written in that familiar looping script, alongside a date format error that matched several of Chelsea's old training memos. "There is one more detail," the examiner said, his voice dropping slightly in the quiet room. He tapped the digital timestamp associated with the restored scanner metadata, then pointed to the handwritten directive from Robert Hale ordering the rejected units removed from the red list. "The timestamp in the preserved image predates your father's written instruction by several hours," the examiner stated clearly. "And the correction slip, establishing the new inventory narrative, carries your sister's initials." The room fell completely silent. The implication hung in the air, cold and undeniable. My sister had not waited for an order from our father. Chelsea had altered the official safety log entirely on her own. She had taken the initiative to manipulate the documentation, and Robert had discovered the unauthorized change only after the fact. Instead of disciplining her or correcting the error, he had seen an opportunity. He had woven her mistake into his larger cover-up, turning her small act of betrayal into a golden leash that bound her to his interests for years. He had convinced her that her commission existed solely because he kept her out of prison. Every time she felt a pang of guilt or considered leaving, he reminded her of the record she had tainted. He had not protected her because he loved her. He had protected her because her crime gave him absolute control over her life. Chelsea had believed she was the favored daughter, the one who understood the cost of success, but she was merely the primary hostage of the system they had built together. The realization hit me with the force of a physical strike. I had spent 15 years resenting her for being the golden child, never understanding that my father had turned her into a prisoner long ago. I looked at the colonel, who was waiting for a reaction. I shook my head slowly, signaling that I understood the full scope of the evidence presented. I did not need to see more. The causal chain was complete, from the initial rejection of the parts to the final, frantic attempts to destroy the evidence. Marcus turned to the investigator. Proceed with the formal evidence handover to the United States Attorney. Ensure every digital export and paper document remains accounted for. I walked toward the side exit, needing the air of the hallway to clear the claustrophobia of the briefing room. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was an incoming call from a number I recognized instantly. It was Chelsea. I stopped in the middle of the quiet corridor. My reflection stared back at me from the polished glass of a display case, showing a woman who had finally dismantled a life built on lies. I had no desire to hear her voice, or listen to the excuses she had spent a lifetime perfecting. I did not want to offer her the emotional labor of a confrontation or the comfort of a sibling bond she had discarded years ago. I silenced the phone and slipped it back into my pocket without answering. I kept walking, leaving the room, the evidence, and my sister's voice behind me. For the first time in 15 years, the future was not something I had to endure or defend. It was simply a space waiting for me to decide what I wanted to build within it, entirely free from the shadow of Hale precision components. I didn't need to win the argument anymore. The records finally spoke for themselves, and for once, the truth was loud enough to be heard without me saying a single word. Susan launched her counterattack with a level of precision that made me realize exactly where my sister had learned her tactics. The Family Association newsletter arrived in my mailbox 2 days later, featuring a thinly veiled statement about the importance of protecting family reputations from disgruntled individuals who used personal grievances to target successful relatives. My mother managed to frame my legitimate safety complaint as a vendetta sparked by a childhood jealousy I had never actually felt. The local blogger who covered Merit Air National Guard social events published a column the following afternoon. It relied heavily on the old, distorted story about my transfer 15 years ago, painting me as a bitter, unstable officer who had been hidden away in safety inspections after failing to handle real responsibility. My phone started buzzing with messages from distant cousins and family friends. One aunt sent a text asking why I could not simply let Chelsea have her one day of glory. I sat in my home office, the screen glowing in the darkened room. My chest felt tight, a dull ache pulsing behind my ribs. I wanted to hit reply. I wanted to send the forensic report, the ledger scans, and the badge access exports to every person on the mailing list. I wanted to scream that I had not been hidden away, but had instead spent a decade and a half becoming the expert who could finally dismantle their house of cards. Lydia called before I could type a single word. My attorney sounded tired, but firm. "Do not engage with the newsletter, Rachel," Lydia said. "Public Affairs has advised you to remain silent while the investigation remains open. If you respond now, they will claim you are using your rank to intimidate private citizens." "They are rewriting the narrative in real time," I said. "If I say nothing, the smear becomes the only version of events." "The narrative does not matter as much as the evidence," Lydia replied. "We have the metadata. We have the ledger. Those facts exist independently of what your mother chooses to print in a local newsletter." I spent the next 6 hours refining my response. I composed a single, austere statement for the Public Affairs Office to release if necessary. It confirmed my recusal, noted that the current investigation originated from an independent crew chief, and insisted that all findings must rely solely on the evidence. It was short, sterile, and entirely unhelpful to Susan's dramatic storytelling. Lydia arrived at my house that evening bringing certified copies of my original complaint records. We spent 3 hours cross-referencing the documents. The transfer order from 15 years ago did not contain a single mention of misconduct. It explicitly referenced conflict management and a transition into system safety assignments. My performance reports from the following years showed consistently high marks, directly contradicting the claim that I had been sidelined. The recusal memo has a timestamp from 4 days before the ceremony, Lydia said, tapping the paper. This proves you did not initiate the investigation as a retaliation for the ceremony. You were already legally removed from the decision process before your sister even stepped onto the podium. That small, mechanical detail felt like a victory. I felt the sharp edges of my anger beginning to dull, replaced by the cold, clear focus of a professional doing her job. Robert's corporate attorney sent a formal letter the next morning. It accused me of selective targeting and violating military ethics by engaging in a family dispute. I did not respond. I watched the clock, waiting for the official word from the investigators. The next surprise came in the form of a request from Robert. The family lawyer called Lydia, suggesting a settlement. Robert offered to establish a scholarship fund in my name, provided Chelsea retracted certain statements, and I ensured that Earl Mercer ceased his cooperation with the federal investigators. He also wanted Maya Torres transferred to a different unit, away from the evidence she had helped preserve. They are trying to buy the silence, I said when Lydia recounted the offer. Robert is also threatening that dozens of innocent employees will lose their payroll if you continue, Lydia added, watching me closely. I looked at the house I had worked so hard to buy, the home I had built entirely independent of my father's money. I would not let him use the livelihoods of his own staff as a shield for his crimes. I instructed Lydia to find an outside receiver who could protect the payroll and assets if the company faced suspension. We would not let the employees become the collateral damage of my father's greed. The pressure mounted. Susan called Earl at home late one Tuesday. She used that soft, trembling voice she saved for people she needed to manipulate. She reminded the old inspector that his wife had relied on the company insurance plan for years. She suggested that he was actively destroying 2 families over an event that had happened more than a decade ago. Earl did not argue, but he did not buckle. He had been instructed to record every conversation. When Susan grew too insistent, he simply reminded her that the dead loadmaster had also left behind a family, then hung up the phone. The voicemail recording was uploaded to the investigative portal within the hour. The next morning, Lydia called after the victim witness coordinator authorized a limited summary of the new findings. The subpoenaed records show that Susan personally approved a consulting severance payment to Earl 1 week after Robert ordered the ledger removed, Lydia said. Investigators also recovered a memorandum in her handwriting. Payment was contingent on Earl having no further contact with investigators. I closed my eyes. My mother had not merely accepted Robert's version of events. She had used the company's money and her administrative authority to secure a witness's silence. I did not ask Lydia to send the bank records or the memorandum. Those documents belonged to the investigators and the court process. The verified summary was enough to change what I understood about Susan. She had not stood beside the cover-up. She had helped manage it. The final piece appeared late Friday night. The storage vendor had recovered a backup archive of the distributor's email server. An analyst highlighted a specific thread from Robert, addressed to both Susan and Earl. Subject: correct the receiving issue before inspection. I scrolled through the preview. The text was blunt. Remove rejected units from the red list, Robert had written. Reissue the records under the distributor lot. Ensure the paperwork mistake does not become a contract issue. My mother had replied to the thread, confirming she would handle the personnel side of the operation. She had been copied on the original directive, and she had immediately moved to secure the silence of the staff. Robert knew the archive had been recovered. The panic in his actions was visible even from a distance. I received word through the investigator that my father had called Chelsea, screaming that she had panicked as a child and ruined everything. He was preparing to discard his own daughter to save himself. Lydia called me at midnight. She did not read the entire message, but she sounded deeply unsettled. "We recovered the specific thread your father sent after you filed the original complaint," my attorney said. "Was Chelsea copied on the email?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the dark house. "No," Lydia replied. "The message was sent only to your mother and Earl. Chelsea was not on the thread." I stared at the black screen of my phone, finally understanding the true architecture of my family. Robert had created the trap, and Susan had helped him build the walls, but he had kept Chelsea entirely in the dark about the initial orders. He had let her believe she was protecting him, all while preparing to turn her into the primary scapegoat the moment the truth threatened his freedom. My sister had been serving a master who viewed her only as a disposable asset. The recovered email from the backup server solidified a truth I had suspected for 15 years. Robert had orchestrated the initial deception and Susan had managed the fallout, yet my sister remained conspicuously absent from the correspondence chain. The logic of my father's cruelty was becoming clear. He had never intended to protect Chelsea. He had merely needed a younger, more malleable set of hands to perform the dirty work so he could maintain plausible deniability. Lydia sat across from me in my home office the next morning with a permitted investigative summary resting on her lap. She did not bring subpoena returns, raw banking records, or protected forensic exhibits. "The analysts completed the corporate bridge," she said. "The serial crosswalk connects the old lot numbers to the repackaged shipments. The manufacturer cage code beneath the new trade name identifies Hale Precision Components, and the federal tax identity and payment routing lead to the same legal entity controlled by Robert." I did not need to see every invoice or wire transfer. Independent analysts had followed the records through channels I did not control. My father had not simply failed to correct an old mistake. He had changed distributors, buried the components inside new lot sequences, and continued the scheme through a legal entity he still owned. He had not just made a mistake, he had maintained a long-term, profitable scheme that treated the lives of flight crews as an acceptable operational cost. My phone rang. The screen displayed Chelsea's name. I hesitated, the vibration against the wooden desk feeling like a physical tremor. I looked at Lydia, who nodded toward the device with a cautious expression. I put the call on speaker. "Rachel," Chelsea said. Her voice sounded thin, stripped of the bravado she had used in the conference room. "The Internal Affairs Office just contacted my counsel. They are stripping my commission status." "The evidence is being processed," I said, keeping my tone professional. "I am no longer involved in the administrative decisions." "I know," Chelsea replied, a small tremor invading her words. "I just wanted to know if you were the one who authorized the referral to the United States Attorney." "I did not," I said. "The federal investigators act on their own findings, Chelsea. You chose your own path when you threatened Maya Torres after I had already recused myself." "I was 22, my sister said, the desperate edge in her voice sharpening. "I was terrified of what Dad would do to the company. He told me I was the only one smart enough to save us." "You were young once," I said, remembering the way she had looked at me across that dinner table all those years ago. "But you were not 22 3 weeks ago when you pressured a crew chief to falsify a maintenance report. You are a senior officer now. You made your own choices." Chelsea did not respond. For a long time, the only sound was the static of the open line. I did not offer her comfort. I did not offer to call the command staff on her behalf. I had spent 15 years being the scapegoat for a family that never once considered the impact of their actions on my life or my career. "I have to go," Chelsea said finally, her voice sounding hollow. "My lawyer is waiting." The line clicked dead. I placed the phone face down on the desk. "She is starting to realize the trap," Lydia said, closing the forensic folder. The moment the pressure hit, Robert did not offer to share the burden. He started looking for someone to take the blame. The reality of that betrayal surfaced an hour later. A document appeared in the shared family legal portal, a draft affidavit Robert had instructed his lawyer to prepare. It was a scorched earth statement that laid every ounce of blame at my sister's feet. It described Chelsea as an unstable junior employee who had acted entirely without authorization to impress her family, while framing Earl as a common thief who had stolen company records to sell to investigators. Susan appeared in the document as an ignorant spouse who signed papers without understanding the technical implications. Robert had intended to burn his own daughter to keep himself out of the reach of the federal prosecutors. He had used the exact same formula he had once used against me, except this time the victim was the golden child who had followed his orders for a decade. Chelsea must have gained access to the document through an automated notification from the legal portal. The realization that her own father viewed her as nothing more than a convenient Wertheisen must have been the final point of collapse. My phone rang again. It was not Chelsea. It was Lydia's direct line. "She called me," Lydia said, her voice unusually subdued. "Chelsea is asking what happens if she decides to cooperate fully. She knows the draft affidavit exists." I looked at the draft document still open on my computer screen, the words designed to ruin my sister's life staring back at me. I thought about the maintenance hangar, the smell of hydraulic fluid, and the young airman Maya Torres. "Tell her she needs an independent lawyer," I said. "Tell her that truthful cooperation is the only path that carries any weight, but it does not erase the choices she made." I did not offer to hold her hand. I did not offer to forgive her. I only offered the truth, the one thing our family had successfully avoided for 15 years. The era of the Hale family narrative was over. The records finally told the real story, and for the first time, I felt the heavy, suffocating weight of my sister's expectations and my father's lies beginning to lift from my shoulders. I was no longer the one who had to save them from themselves. I was simply the one who had made sure the record was finally correct. The hearing room at Merritt Air National Guard Base felt smaller and tighter than the auditorium where Chelsea had received her promotion. The walls were a sterile institutional gray, and the harsh fluorescent lights flickered with a rhythmic, irritating buzz. I sat in the witness row, my posture straight, keeping my hands resting calmly on my lap. I did not belong at the panel table, and I did not belong with the family, so I occupied the space in between, watching the process unfold with a cool, detached clarity. Chelsea sat at the defense table alone. Her dress uniform lacked the new rank insignia that had sparked such chaos only a few weeks prior. She looked diminished, the crispness of her presentation undone by the weight of the investigation. Susan and Robert occupied the front row directly behind her, their faces masks of carefully controlled outrage. My father gripped the head of his cane so tightly that his knuckles were bone white. Susan hela designa henbe in her lip, her fingers tracing the leather over and over in a nervous, repetitive motion. Colonel Marcus Reed opened the proceedings with a crisp, clipped tone. He clarified the purpose of the session. It was an integrity and fitness for command review, not a criminal trial, but the evidence presented would determine the future of Chelsea's career. Maya Torres was the first witness called to the stand. The young crew chief walked to the witness box with her shoulders pulled back. She did not look at the defense table. She looked directly at the panel of officers deciding the case. Maya laid out the sequence of events with painful, granular detail. She described the initial discovery of the hairline crack in the actuator, the immediate decision to red tag the component, and the subsequent pressure she received to falsify the cause code. When the prosecution read the text messages where Chelsea had implied that Maya's career would end if she did not comply, a collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the small gallery. Chelsea's counsel attempted to frame the intimidation as a common, high-pressure management style. He asked Maya if she had ever felt overwhelmed by the operational demands of the logistics wing. "Readiness that depends on hiding a cracked part is not readiness," Maya said, her voice ringing clear and steady across the room. I decided not to become the person who obeyed because she was afraid. She looked at Chelsea then, a brief moment of acknowledgement that felt heavier than any shout or scream. I caught the look and felt a surge of pride. Maya had not been saved by me. She had saved herself by choosing the truth when the pressure to stay silent had been almost absolute. The panel moved to the evidence of the past. The forensic expert explained the findings from the restored legal hold image. He detailed how the workstation login, the badge access logs, and the specific timestamp of the replacement scan all pointed to a single operator. Chelsea had entered the office after hours, utilized the scanner, and pushed the doctored document into the maintenance system. The defense counsel argued that the forensic evidence was circumstantial, relying on a chain of events, rather than a single, undeniable photograph of the act. I watched my father's face. He knew the argument was weak. He had spent years teaching his children how to manipulate paper, never imagining that the paper itself would eventually develop a memory. My mother was called to the witness chair next. Susan claimed she had acted merely as an administrative assistant for her husband, signing documents without truly grasping their technical or legal significance. She spoke with a trembling, melodic sincerity that had worked on me for 20 years. But the prosecution did not ask about her administrative role. They played the voicemail she had left for Earl Mercer. The quiet, gentle voice filled the room, warning the old inspector about the consequences of speaking to the authorities. Susan's own words contradicted the image of the ignorant, passive spouse she was projecting. A visible shift occurred in the gallery. Members of the Military Family Association, people who had hosted Susan at countless community events, began to look at her with expressions of profound, disgusted realization. Robert followed, his testimony an exercise in frantic redirection. He blamed the initial error on a clerical mistake, then shifted the responsibility for the cover-up to the distributor, and finally tried to minimize the impact of the flight control failure as an unavoidable training accident. Every time he spoke, the lead investigator introduced another layer of the record. The email Robert had sent, the payment routing to his private entities, and the serial crosswalk showing the repackaging of the failed units made his claims of innocence look like a farce. By the time the prosecution finished with my father, the room felt drained of oxygen. The atmosphere had changed from a dispute between a general and her family into an indictment of a company that had traded lives for profit. The promotion rescission was a foregone conclusion. Marcus read the preliminary findings of the panel, noting a pattern of dishonesty and a complete failure to manage the clear family conflicts of interest. Chelsea was to be relieved of her command pending the final review, and her advancement was officially withdrawn. When the proceedings reached the final stage, the chair allowed the defendant one last statement. Robert's attorney hissed at Chelsea to remain silent, gesturing for her to decline the opportunity. My sister stood up slowly. She looked at our father, then at my mother, and finally at me. 15 years ago, Chelsea began, her voice cracking before she forced it steady. My sister did not alter that maintenance record. Robert rose so fast that his chair struck the floor behind him. Marcus ordered him to sit down. I did, Chelsea said. She turned toward the panel rather than our father. I entered the office after hours. I scanned the replacement log before my father gave anyone a written order to change the records. I saw the red tags, and I thought that fixing the paperwork would make me the daughter who saved the company. Robert's attorney told her to stop. Chelsea continued. When my father discovered what I had done, he did not correct it. He used my lie. He ordered the rejected units removed, changed the distributor records, and taught me that protecting the family meant protecting whatever he wanted hidden. The timestamp, badge record, correction slip, and her own admission finally aligned. Chelsea had not acted only because Robert commanded her. She had made the first choice herself, then allowed him to turn that choice into a system. She had been manipulated. She had also participated. Both truths could exist at the same time. I did not feel a rush of triumph. I felt only a profound, hollow exhaustion. As the hearing concluded, The officers moved to file the final paperwork, their movements efficient and cold. Federal investigators appeared at the edge of the room. They waited until the formal session adjourned, then moved to intercept my father in the hallway. They handed him a notice prohibiting him from transferring any further assets or contacting any potential witnesses. Robert stopped, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He looked at me, his eyes burning with the accusation he had used for over a decade. "You think she will save you after this? You think this makes you the winner?" Chelsea stepped into the space between us. She did not look at our father with love or fear. She looked at him with the chilling clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose. "No," Chelsea said. "I am finally telling the truth without asking her to save me." I turned away from them, walking toward the exit doors. I did not wait to see what happened next. I had watched the architecture of their lives collapse under the weight of the records they thought they had destroyed. The truth had not been a weapon I wielded against them. It had simply been the reality that they had been running from for far too long. I reached the door and pushed it open, stepping out into the cool air, leaving the wreckage of the Hale family inside the room. My work was finished, and for the first time, I could finally breathe without checking the record. The silence in the aftermath of the hearing felt heavy, a thick shroud that clung to my skin even as I drove away from the base. Over the coming weeks, the collapse of my family's world transitioned from the explosive confrontation in the hearing room to the slow, grinding reality of federal indictment and financial liquidation. The change happened in pieces, week by week, as the legal system began its methodical process of dismantling a lifetime of constructed deception. Prosecutors moved forward with formal charges related to continuing procurement fraud, the systematic falsification of government records, and an extensive conspiracy to obstruct justice. Each filing brought a new wave of details to the surface, unearthing the precise ways my father had manipulated the supply chain to prioritize corporate margins over basic safety standards. Chelsea hired an independent counsel who advised her that cooperation offered the only viable path to mitigating her sentence. She provided federal investigators with detailed access logs, family communications, and her personal account of Robert's control. My sister was not spared from the consequences of her choices. She still faced the permanent loss of her commission and the revocation of her security clearance. She had participated in the maintenance of the scheme long after she became an adult, and the legal repercussions reflected that reality. The cooperation she offered helped prosecutors map the entire network of subcontractors, but it did not erase the fact that she had actively intimidated Maya Torres to protect her status. Susan faced charges related to obstruction and witness intimidation, her role in the payment of the hush money, and the manufacturing of false affidavits, finally stripped of its veneer of wifely devotion. My mother's attempts to claim ignorance evaporated once the bank records, showing her personal approval of the severance payments, became public. Robert remained the primary target, yet he fought the legal proceedings with a desperate, self-destructive energy. Even after receiving an explicit notice from the court prohibiting him from transferring assets or interacting with potential witnesses, he continued to move money through holding accounts managed by a cousin. He called several former employees, demanding they sign declarations stating that Chelsea had acted entirely on her own initiative. Each of those phone calls was documented by the recipients, who had been instructed by their lawyers to report any contact. Those calls turned into new counts of obstruction. My father seemed unable to grasp that his old methods of influence no longer functioned in a world where the records were finally open. He treated the court system like he treated his warehouse floor, assuming everything had a price and every obstacle could be removed with the right amount of pressure. I observed the process from a distance. I did not participate in the daily mechanics of the prosecution, nor did I seek out updates on their misery. I learned what was happening through public filings, or the occasional victim witness notification update that appeared in my inbox. Seeing the slow, inevitable erosion of their status felt less like a victory and more like watching a long overdue structural failure. My aunt sent me a brief, cold message regarding the family association, which had finally stripped my mother of her leadership position. I felt nothing when I read it. The connection between my internal sense of worth and their approval had been severed so thoroughly that even the news of their total social exile felt like reading about strangers in a foreign city. The most difficult consequence involved the company itself. Hale Precision Components faced federal suspension, and dozens of floor employees risked losing jobs, even though they had never participated in Robert's fraud. Through Lydia, I submitted a victim impact statement asking the court-appointed receiver to preserve innocent jobs wherever legally and financially possible. I did not select a buyer, negotiate the sale, or impose conditions on the court. The receiver separated the viable contracts and usable machinery from the fraudulent operation. After an independent bidding process, a qualified buyer acquired those assets and chose to retain most of the existing floor staff. The decision belonged to the receiver and the new owner, not to me. Robert had spent years using his employees as human shields whenever anyone questioned his conduct. In the end, the legal process separated their livelihoods from his ownership. The sale proceeds went toward restitution, recalls, inspections, and the damages caused by the training accident. Chelsea's sentencing took place first. The judge credited her truthful cooperation, but made clear that cooperation did not erase the replacement scan, the current falsified report, or the threat she had directed at Maya. Chelsea received 3 years in federal prison. Her commission and security clearance were permanently lost. After the hearing, Chelsea asked Maya for 1 minute in the presence of both attorneys. "I threatened your career because I was afraid of losing mine," Chelsea said. "I made you carry the same choice Rachel carried. I am sorry." Maya kept her hands at her sides. "Do not ask the next person to risk what you would not," she said. Chelsea nodded. She did not ask to be forgiven. Her eyes moved toward me, but I offered only a small acknowledgement. Telling the truth had ended the lie. It did not restore our relationship. Susan received 18 months for obstruction, witness intimidation, and her role in the false affidavits and severance payment. At her sentencing, she repeated that she had only protected her family. The prosecutor placed 3 records beside one another, her signature authorizing Earl's payment, her handwritten condition forbidding further contact with investigators, the recording of her voice pressuring him to remain silent. The judge asked whether protecting a family required threatening a witness whose testimony concerned a fatal accident. Susan had no answer. For the first time in my life, her silence did not force me to fill the space for her. The most intense moment of the final months came just before my father's sentencing. His legal team reached out to Lydia with a desperate final request. They wanted a character letter from me. Robert needed me to state that he was a devoted father who had acted only out of a misguided desire to protect his company and his children. They wanted me to write that he had never once pressured me to compromise my ethics. Robert arranged for a single recorded message to be sent to my personal device. I listened to his voice, that familiar, commanding tone I had heard at every dinner table for 2 decades. He talked about how he had provided for me, paid for my education, and opened the doors to a military career I never would have attained on my own. He warned me that if I did not help him, he would die in prison, and the responsibility for his death would rest entirely on my conscience. I looked at the blank page on my laptop screen. I thought about the car he had bought me, which I had returned the moment he asked me to lie. I thought about the education he paid for, which I had used to build a career he never understood or respected. I began to type. I did not write a letter of support, and I did not write a letter of condemnation. I simply listed the facts of the case as they had been established by the court. I wrote about the decision he made to sacrifice the safety of his employees and the flight crews to save his contracts. I wrote about the phone calls to my mother and the pressure applied to the staff. I included the details of the red-tagged components and the calculated effort to erase the record. I did not suggest a length for his sentence, nor did I ask for mercy. I finished the letter with a clear, direct observation about the nature of our history. My father had taught me that a record was the only way to decide who was believed, and I had simply learned the lesson he provided. I sent the document to the court, the file stamped and delivered in full compliance with the judicial requirements. Robert received 8 years, a sentence that would likely see him spend the remainder of his active life behind bars. The court also ordered debarment, ensuring he could never again hold a federal contract or influence government procurement. The day after the sentencing, the air in my house felt different. It was cleaner, lighter, almost entirely devoid of the tension that had governed my life since the age of 25. I walked into my office and closed the laptop, finally allowing myself to step away from the documents that had consumed every spare moment of my time. My phone vibrated. It was a postcard from Chelsea, postmarked from the federal facility where she was serving her term. She had written only a single sentence on the back. I told the truth in the next interview. I picked up the postcard, read the words, and placed it in the back of my desk drawer. I did not need to reply. I did not need to offer her an emotional connection or a path to reconciliation. She had taken the responsibility for her actions, and she had begun the process of correcting the record. That was all I had ever wanted. I walked out to the kitchen, feeling a strange, quiet satisfaction in the stillness of the house. I had not destroyed my father's company. I had not been responsible for his conviction. I had only refused to help him hide the truth of what he had done with it. The machine had finally stopped, not because I was the strongest person in the room, but because I had refused to be the one who kept it running. The weight of the last 15 years had dissipated. I went to the window and watched the afternoon sun stretching across the backyard, a golden, peaceful light that felt entirely my own. The story was over, and for the first time I was free to start a chapter that had nothing to do with the name I had carried for so long. The records were correct. The truth was finally at rest. I poured a glass of water, sat at my butcher block table, and watched the trees sway in the breeze. There was nothing left to do but live. The sunlight pouring into my kitchen felt different that morning, softer and less demanding than the harsh fluorescent glare I had grown accustomed to in the briefing rooms of Merritt Air National Guard Base. I sat at my butcher block table, the surface smooth and cool beneath my fingertips, and watched the oak tree in my backyard sway in a gentle, persistent breeze. The silence of the house was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of a secret waiting to be exposed. It was simply peace. 2 weeks after Robert's sentencing, a certified envelope arrived from the Inspector General Review Office. I opened it at my butcher block table. The amended determination formally substantiated my original safety complaint. It confirmed that the rejected lot had presented a genuine material and traceability risk, and that records associated with the complaint had been intentionally altered. The final paragraph addressed my transfer from 15 years earlier. The move into system safety had been a conflict management measure intended to protect the integrity of the investigation. It had not resulted from misconduct, incompetence, cowardice, or disciplinary action. I read that paragraph twice. Public Affairs asked whether I wanted to participate in a profile about the general whose family had falsely called her a military failure. I declined. I requested only that the corrected finding identify the safety failure, acknowledge the dead loadmaster and injured crew members, and explain how written technical dissent would be protected in the future. My name no longer needed to be the largest name in the story. The official record finally said what had happened. A few months after the sentencing, I found myself returning to the maintenance hangar for a routine site visit. It felt like a lifetime had passed since that morning in October, though the calendar insisted it had been less than a year. I walked across the concrete floor, my boots clicking rhythmically, listening to the familiar chorus of pneumatic tools and the distant, throaty hum of a jet engine undergoing testing. Maya Torres walked toward me, her pace steady and her uniform impeccable. She was supervising a young airman who was currently tagging a worn component. I paused near the safety line, leaning against the metal support beam, watching the interaction. The young airman held the tag, his brow furrowed in concentration. He glanced toward the office where the senior maintenance supervisor sat, his posture uncertain. "What happens if a commander tells me to remove this tag before the review is complete?" the airman asked, his voice low and edged with genuine confusion. Maya did not hesitate. She looked the airman in the eye, her expression firm but patient. "Ask for the order in writing," Maya said. "Then you call the safety office and you submit a technical dissent. You do not touch that tag until the system clears it." I stood in the shadows of the support beam and listened, a small, involuntary smile touching my lips. I did not intervene. I did not need to offer my own perspective or provide a lecture on the ethics of the maintenance chain. Maya had internalized the lesson, and she was already passing the knowledge down to the next generation of technicians. She was ensuring that no young mechanic would ever feel forced to choose between their career and their conscience. Maya handed the red tag to the young airman, letting him press his own pen to the paper to sign it. She watched him verify the serial number, her guidance subtle but absolute. That exchange represented the final, essential payoff of everything I had fought to preserve. The red tag was no longer a symbol of my cowardice, as my mother had once claimed, nor was it a trigger for my father's wrath. It had become what it was always intended to be, proof that someone had finally been brave enough to stop the machine, and in doing so, had created a space for others to be brave as well. The airman finished the documentation and walked toward the supply storage, leaving Maya alone by the workbench. She turned and noticed me standing near the support beam. She did not rush over or offer a salute that would have felt too formal for the moment. She simply offered a short, knowing nod, a shared acknowledgement of the hard work we had both endured. I returned the gesture and turned toward the exit, the smell of hydraulic fluid no longer acting as a tether to my past, but rather as the familiar, workaday scent of an environment where people were finally doing the right thing. Walking out into the bright afternoon, I realized the full extent of my own transformation. I had spent 15 years defining my existence in opposition to the people who had tried to erase me. I had curated my life as a deliberate contradiction to their values, holding my records like a shield and my autonomy like a weapon. The burden of that vigilance had been immense, yet I had carried it without truly understanding the cost until the moment the weight was finally gone. I drove home along the quiet, winding roads, enjoying the sensation of simply being in control of my own movement. I stopped at a local nursery on the way, spending an hour wandering through rows of hardy perennials. I purchased a pair of white hydrangeas and a small lilac bush, planning to plant them near the kitchen window where I spent most of my mornings. The act of planting, of coaxing growth out of the earth, felt like a deliberate movement toward a future I had never truly envisioned for myself. That evening, I sat on my back porch as the sky faded from a brilliant, piercing blue to the soft, bruised purple of twilight. My phone sat on the table beside me, entirely silent. The fear that a call would bring news of another disaster had vanished, replaced by the simple, profound anticipation of a quiet night. I thought about the postcard Chelsea had sent from the correctional facility. I had read the words, tucked the paper into my drawer, and allowed myself the small grace of acknowledging her admission of guilt. I would never be the sister who visited her in prison, and I would never be the daughter who reconciled with a mother who had signed the documents that destroyed my reputation. The boundaries I had drawn were not acts of cruelty, but necessary protections for a life that was finally, entirely my own. The house behind me stood solid and peaceful, a space I had earned through years of disciplined, quiet work. I had not sought a grand, public confrontation. I had simply demanded that the truth remain recorded, preserved, and eventually heard. The legal system had provided the mechanism for justice, but the restoration of my own sense of reality had been an internal journey, one that required me to stop waiting for them to apologize and start building the life I had been denied. The following morning, I went out to the backyard with my gardening tools. I dug into the soft, damp soil, the scent of the earth rising up to meet me. Each movement felt grounded and purposeful. I cleared away the old debris from the previous season, preparing the ground for the new arrivals. The work was simple, physical, and deeply satisfying. As I tamped down the soil around the base of the lilac bush, I thought about the many ways I had been defined by my family's perspective. They had viewed my refusal to falsify maintenance logs as a professional failing and my decision to leave as a personal defeat. They had mistaken my silence for compliance and my resilience for stubbornness. They had believed that by controlling the records, they controlled the reality, never understanding that the truth possessed a stubborn, persistent life of its own. I picked up the hose, letting the cool water wash over the freshly turned dirt. The water turned the soil into a dark, rich contrast against the pale petals of the hydrangeas. Everything about the process felt like an act of creation, not just for the garden, but for the version of myself that was finally taking root. My phone rang inside the house, a bright, cheerful sound that I didn't rush to answer. I finished with the garden, wiped my hands on my jeans, and finally walked inside. The caller was a colleague from the Systems Safety Office, asking for my input on a new procedural review. I sat at my desk and pulled up the files, my mind clear and engaged, entirely focused on the work at hand. The discussion was technical, demanding, and utterly devoid of the poisonous personal drama that had defined the previous months. When the call concluded, I felt a familiar sense of professional satisfaction. I was back in the orbit of the work I loved, operating with the full authority of my rank and the hard-won wisdom of my experience. The military had once intended for this work to be a place to hide me, a dusty corner of the bureaucracy where I would wither into insignificance. Instead, I had used that very work to protect thousands of lives, proving that the integrity of a system was always more important than the reputation of an individual. I spent the next few weeks immersing myself in the safety reviews, enjoying the quiet power of a technical record that no longer required a defense. My chosen family drifted through the house on weekends, bringing laughter and normalcy back into the rooms that had felt so cold during the height of the investigation. Lydia came over for coffee, her professional focus finally relaxing into a genuine, unhurried friendship. We talked about her upcoming cases, about the garden, about the simple, uncomplicated joy of seeing the law function exactly as it was designed to. One afternoon, I sat in my office and opened the desk drawer where I kept the old holiday cards. I took the small stack of glossy photographs out and looked at them one last time. Chelsea smiled back at me from the fireplace mantel, looking young and untouched by the reality of what she had helped build. I didn't feel hatred, and I didn't feel the sharp, stinging need for revenge. I simply felt the detachment of someone watching a photograph from a museum, a relic of a life that no longer belonged to me. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, throwing the cards into the recycling bin. The act was quick and final. I didn't need the physical reminders of who they wanted me to be. I knew who I was, and the world now knew it as well. The record had been corrected. My father would spend his remaining years in prison, stripped of his companies and his influence. My mother would live with the consequences of her choices, watching her social world contract into the lonely, bitter reality of her own making. My sister would serve her time, hopefully finding a path to a life built on something more substantial than a father's approval. I walked back outside to the garden, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. The white hydrangeas were beginning to bloom, their petals opening slowly to the light. Everything in the yard felt vibrant, healthy, and entirely authentic. For 15 years, the red tag had hung over my life, a symbol of everything my family said I was afraid to face. They believed the tag marked a failure, a moment where I had been too weak to follow the instructions of the powerful. They were wrong. The tag had never been a symbol of fear, and it had never been a mark of my incompetence. It was, and always would be, the proof that I had been brave enough to stop the machine. I picked up my gardening gloves and looked at the white petals of the hydrangeas. The story of who I was and where I came from had been written by them for a very long time, but that power was gone. I was the one holding the pen now, and I had no intention of writing anything but the truth. The garden was growing, the air was clear, and for the first time in my life, I was finally, completely home. You have spent your entire life believing that your value is tied to the approval of those who never truly wanted you to succeed. You have carried the weight of their expectations, their manipulation, and their distorted version of your reality, as if it were your own burden to bear. The story you have been told that you are failing, or that you are too sensitive, or that your integrity is a liability, is a fabrication designed only to keep you in your place. Understand that standing alone for the truth is not a sign of weakness. It is the most powerful choice you can make. When you refuse to participate in a lie, you stop being a victim of the machine and start becoming the one who controls your own narrative. Integrity is not about being perfect or pleasing others. It is about keeping your record clean and your conscience clear. No one has the power to define who you are unless you grant them that authority. Now that you see the cycle for what it really is, what is one truth you have been keeping hidden that you are finally ready to speak aloud for your own sake?